What started as a normal daytime discussion suddenly turned into an on-air moment no one expected. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not because anyone planned it, but because two very different perspectives suddenly collide in real time. Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. When Kim Kardashian appeared on a daytime talk show like The View, the expectation in the studio felt familiar to anyone who regularly watches these kinds of programs. The audience had settled in for a conversation that would likely touch on celebrity, business, advocacy, and maybe a few lighter moments mixed in between. Kim walked out to warm applause, smiling, waving, taking her seat at the table with the practiced ease of someone who has done live television countless times before. The hosts greeted her in turn, and the opening minutes moved exactly the way viewers at home would expect. There were compliments about her recent projects, brief references to her work in criminal justice reform, and some relaxed back and forth meant to set a comfortable tone. Joy Behar, as she often does, brought a mix of humor and skepticism to the conversation early on. Her comments were light at first, a slightly raised eyebrow here, a half smile there, the kind of delivery longtime viewers recognize as Joy's way of keeping the discussion grounded. Kim responded politely, nodding, offering concise answers, clearly prepared for questions that might probe a little deeper than a red carpet interview would. The table dynamic felt balanced, with other co-hosts occasionally chiming in to keep the pace moving. As the segment progressed, the conversation naturally shifted toward Kim's influence and public platform. One of the hosts mentioned the sheer size of her audience and asked how she thinks about responsibility when speaking on social or political issues. Kim leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, and talked about learning over time, about listening to experts, and about using her reach to highlight causes she cares about. Her tone was measured, careful, and calm, the way it often is when she's discussing topics that invite scrutiny. Joy listened, nodding at first, but as Kim spoke, Joy's posture changed. She leaned back in her chair, arms loosely crossed, her expression becoming more serious. When Kim finished her thought, there was a brief pause, just long enough for viewers to sense a shift. Joy then jumped in, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a pointed question that reframed the conversation. She asked whether celebrity activism sometimes oversimplifies complex issues, especially when those issues affect people who don't have the same resources or visibility. The question wasn't delivered as an attack, but it landed with weight. Kim took a breath before answering, and the studio audience grew noticeably quieter. The hosts at the table glanced at one another, a subtle but familiar sign that the discussion had entered more serious territory. Kim responded by emphasizing that she doesn't see herself as an expert, but as someone trying to help bring attention where it's needed. She spoke about partnering with lawyers, advocates, and organizations, and stressed that she tries to amplify voices rather than replace them. Joy followed up almost immediately, gently interrupting to clarify her point. She acknowledged Kim's intentions but questioned whether intention alone is enough when the stakes are high. Her voice remained steady, but her tone was firmer now. This is where viewers could feel the tension begin to build, not in a dramatic way, but in the distinctly real way that live conversations sometimes do. It was the sound of two people talking past each other just slightly, each trying to articulate something important from their own perspective. Kim's body language shifted again. She sat more upright, her expression tightening just a bit, signaling that she felt the need to be precise. She reiterated her commitment to learning and pointed out specific examples of outcomes she felt proud of. She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully, as if aware that every sentence was being weighed not just by the hosts, but by millions of viewers at home. At the table, another host attempted to ease the moment by stepping in, offering a bridging comment about how public conversations around activism have evolved. For a moment, it seemed like the discussion might pivot back to safer ground. Joy nodded, but didn't fully let the point go. She returned to the idea of accountability, suggesting that celebrities inevitably shape public opinion, whether they intend to or not. The exchange remained controlled, but the energy in the studio had changed. Audience members shifted in their seats, some nodding along, others watching intently without reacting. There were no gasps or audible reactions, just the quiet attentiveness that signals a room full of people aware they're witnessing a genuine disagreement unfold live. Kim listened this time without interrupting, her gaze fixed on Joy, occasionally glancing down at the table before looking back up. When Kim spoke again, her voice was still calm, but there was a noticeable edge of defensiveness, not anger, but resolve. She talked about being criticized no matter what she does, about how silence is also criticized, and about the difficulty of navigating public expectations. She acknowledged that mistakes can happen, but emphasized growth and responsibility as ongoing processes. Joy responded with a short nod, then added a final comment that framed her concern as one shared by many viewers. She said that questioning public figures isn't about tearing them down, but about pushing conversations forward. Her delivery softened slightly at the end, and that subtle shift helped de-escalate the moment. By this point, the other hosts were clearly working to bring the segment back into balance. One offered a summarizing remark, highlighting common ground between Kim's intentions and Joy's concerns. Another thanked Kim for being willing to engage in the conversation at all. Kim smiled politely, though the smile didn't fully reach her eyes, and nodded in appreciation. The segment moved on to another topic shortly after, but the tone remained more subdued than it had been at the start. The earlier ease was gone, replaced by a sense that something meaningful, if uncomfortable, had just taken place. For viewers watching live, it felt like one of those moments that aren't planned, but linger in your mind after the show cuts to commercial. As the cameras pulled back and the discussion transitioned, the audience applause was polite but restrained. The hosts shuffled their notes, adjusted their posture, and reset their expressions, the way seasoned television professionals do when navigating a live moment that didn't follow the expected script. And for viewers at home, the exchange between Kim Kardashian and Joy Behar became the part of the episode that stood out, not because it was explosive, but because it felt real, unresolved, and very much in line with the kind of conversations daytime television sometimes surfaces when differing worldviews meet at the same table. As the conversation continued after that initial shift in tone, the atmosphere at the table didn't snap back to light or casual. Instead, it settled into something quieter and more deliberate, the kind of mood that longtime viewers recognize as a sign that the hosts are aware they're in sensitive territory. The cameras stayed wide a beat longer than usual, capturing the subtle movements at the table. Joy adjusted her glasses and shuffled her note cards. Kim took a sip of water, a small pause that felt less like a break and more like a moment to regroup. One of the co-hosts attempted to broaden the discussion by referencing how often public figures, especially women, are judged differently when they speak out. This framing seemed designed to pull the focus away from any one person and toward a more general conversation. Kim nodded in agreement, her shoulders relaxing slightly, and she added that she's aware of the scrutiny and tries not to let it stop her from engaging. Her voice was even, but there was a noticeable emphasis on the word tries, suggesting a quiet acknowledgement of how complicated that balance can be. Joy listened carefully, leaning forward now rather than back, her elbows lightly resting on the table. When she spoke again, she didn't raise her voice, but her words were precise. She pointed out that while scrutiny can be unfair, it also comes with the territory of influence. She referenced past moments in pop culture where celebrity involvement shifted public conversations in unexpected ways, sometimes productively, sometimes not. The way she spoke made it clear she wasn't singling Kim out as a problem, but rather using her as an example within a larger pattern. The studio audience reacted subtly. A few heads nodded. There was no applause, but there was a faint murmur, the kind of collective response that's felt more than heard. Kim's expression remained attentive, though her jaw tightened briefly, a small but telling sign. When she replied, she acknowledged Joy's point but circled back to personal accountability, saying she holds herself responsible for learning and correcting course when necessary. At this point, another host gently interjected, reminding viewers that Kim's involvement in criminal justice reform had included extensive behind-the-scenes work that didn't always make headlines. This comment felt like an attempt to recenter Kim's credibility in the discussion. Kim thanked her with a quick smile, but Joy raised a hand slightly, signaling she wanted to respond before the topic moved on. Joy's next comment was quieter but more direct. She said that part of her concern was how audiences interpret celebrity messages, especially when those messages are clipped, shared, and stripped of nuance on social media. She mentioned that daytime talk shows themselves contribute to that ecosystem, often unintentionally. As she spoke, she glanced briefly toward the camera, acknowledging the viewers at home as part of the conversation. Kim responded by agreeing that social media complicates everything. She described how she's seen her words taken out of context and how frustrating that can be. Her tone softened here, becoming more personal. She admitted that even with preparation, she sometimes feels misunderstood. This admission shifted the energy slightly. The room felt less like a debate and more like a difficult conversation unfolding in real time. Still, the tension didn't disappear. Joy followed up with a question that cut closer to the heart of the issue. She asked whether Kim ever worries that her brand, built largely in entertainment and commerce, affects how seriously people take her advocacy. The question landed heavily. There was a brief pause, longer than earlier ones, as Kim considered how to respond. The audience remained silent. Even the other hosts stayed still, their eyes on Kim. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but slower than before. She said she's aware of the perception and that it's something she's had to confront repeatedly. She talked about proving seriousness through action rather than image, and about accepting that not everyone will be convinced. Her hands rested flat on the table now, a grounded posture that suggested determination. Joy nodded, acknowledging the answer, but didn't immediately move on. Instead, she added that skepticism isn't always a dismissal, but sometimes a call for deeper engagement. Her tone softened again, and she smiled faintly, signaling that her intent wasn't to corner Kim but to explore the issue honestly. That smile, small as it was, seemed to ease the room just a bit. One of the co-hosts used the opening to shift gears slightly, asking Kim how these conversations affect her personally. Kim's response was reflective. She spoke about developing thicker skin over the years, about learning when to listen and when to stand firm. As she spoke, her shoulders relaxed, and her cadence became more conversational. This felt like a moment of recalibration, both for her and for the show. Joy listened without interrupting this time, her head tilted slightly, an expression of genuine consideration on her face. When Kim finished, Joy added a brief comment about resilience and growth, acknowledging that public evolution isn't easy. It was a short statement, but it carried weight because it suggested common ground. The hosts collectively seemed to sense that the segment needed to find its footing again. One summarized the discussion by noting that these kinds of exchanges are exactly why daytime talk shows exist, to bring different perspectives into the same space. The comment earned light applause from the audience, the first clear reaction in several minutes. The sound broke some of the lingering tension, reminding everyone that they were still watching a live broadcast designed to facilitate dialogue. As the conversation edged toward a wrap-up, Kim was asked one final question about what she hopes viewers take away from her advocacy. She answered succinctly, focusing on awareness, compassion, and continued learning. Joy nodded along, her posture relaxed again, signaling that the more intense part of the exchange had passed. Still, the emotional residue remained. The hosts exchanged quick glances, silently coordinating the transition to the next segment. Kim smiled and thanked them for the conversation, her tone polite and composed. Joy returned the smile, adding a brief remark about appreciating open dialogue, which drew a small ripple of applause. As the show moved forward, viewers at home were left with a lingering sense that they had witnessed something unscripted but meaningful. It wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic walk-off. It was a careful, sometimes uncomfortable exchange that reflected real differences in perspective. And for many watching, that quiet tension, stretched across minutes of live television, was far more compelling than any rehearsed soundbite. The cameras eventually cut to a commercial break, but the conversation didn't end there for the audience. Social media began to light up almost immediately, with clips circulating and viewers weighing in on both sides. In the studio, though, the moment had been handled with restraint, professionalism, and a shared understanding that daytime television, at its best, makes room for disagreement without letting it spiral out of control. When the show returned from commercial, the energy was noticeably different from the start of the segment. Viewers who had stepped away briefly could sense it almost immediately. The hosts' expressions were more focused, their voices slightly more measured, as if everyone at the table was aware that the earlier exchange had shifted the rhythm of the hour. Kim was still seated comfortably, but her posture suggested alertness rather than ease. Joy sat upright, hands folded, her attention forward, no longer leaning into humor as she often does after a break. One of the co-hosts briefly recapped the previous topic in a neutral way, a common technique on live television to reorient viewers who might have tuned in late. The recap avoided framing the conversation as a disagreement, instead emphasizing that the discussion had explored different perspectives on influence and responsibility. Kim nodded along as the recap unfolded, offering a polite smile at the end. Joy gave a short nod of her own, signaling agreement with the framing. The next question directed at Kim was related, but slightly removed from the earlier tension. She was asked about how she prepares for interviews when she knows serious topics may come up. Kim explained that she tries to do as much research as possible and that she anticipates tough questions, especially on shows known for candid conversation. As she spoke, her voice was steady, and she gestured lightly with her hands, a sign that she felt more at ease addressing process rather than critique. Joy listened without interruption, her expression attentive. When Kim finished, Joy added a brief comment about preparation being important, especially in a media environment where clips can circulate without context. This comment echoed one of her earlier concerns, but in a less confrontational way. The shift in delivery didn't go unnoticed. The audience responded with a few murmurs of agreement, and one or two people nodded visibly. Another co-host took the opportunity to widen the lens again, bringing up the role of daytime talk shows themselves. She mentioned that programs like this one often walk a fine line between accessibility and depth, trying to engage a broad audience while still addressing complex issues. This meta-commentary seemed intentional, almost reflective, as if the show was momentarily examining its own role in shaping conversations. Joy responded to that point by acknowledging the challenge, saying that the format doesn't always allow for nuance, but that doesn't mean nuance shouldn't be attempted. She spoke calmly, with a hint of wry humor, which drew a soft chuckle from the audience. Kim smiled at that, the first genuine smile in a few minutes, suggesting that the tension had eased enough for some levity to return. Still, the earlier exchange lingered just beneath the surface. When Kim was asked about feedback she receives from viewers, she referenced moments like this one, saying that not everyone agrees with her approach, but she values hearing different viewpoints. Her tone was thoughtful rather than defensive. She looked briefly toward Joy as she said this, a subtle acknowledgement that didn't go unnoticed. Joy met the glance and responded with a small nod. She then added that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect, and that healthy skepticism can coexist with appreciation. Her voice was softer now, and her body language more open. The comment felt like a conscious effort to reframe the earlier tension as constructive rather than adversarial. The studio audience reacted positively. There was light applause, not loud or prolonged, but enough to mark a turning point in the segment. The sound seemed to lift the mood slightly, and the hosts relaxed back into their chairs. Kim took another sip of water, her shoulders dropping just a bit, as if releasing some of the tension she'd been carrying. As the conversation continued, it moved toward Kim's broader career, touching on her business ventures and public visibility. These topics were familiar territory, and Kim spoke with confidence. Joy participated by asking practical questions, occasionally inserting a humorous aside. The earlier seriousness hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer dominated the exchange. Even so, there were moments when the underlying themes resurfaced. When discussing public perception, Joy remarked that visibility can be both a platform and a burden. Kim agreed, adding that she's learned to accept that not every conversation will end in consensus. The way she said it suggested a kind of acceptance, perhaps shaped by experiences like the one unfolding at the table. The hosts appeared increasingly mindful of time. One glanced toward the stage manager, another checked her notes. It was clear they were approaching the end of Kim's appearance. As is common in these situations, The final questions were designed to leave the audience with a sense of closure. Kim was asked what she hopes people understand about her beyond headlines and social media clips. Her answer was brief, but sincere. She spoke about wanting to be seen as someone who's evolving, learning, and trying to contribute in meaningful ways. She didn't reference the earlier disagreement directly, but the context gave her words added weight. Joy listened quietly, her expression neutral but attentive. When Kim finished, Joy offered a closing comment that acknowledged effort and intention, even while maintaining her belief in the importance of scrutiny. She said that conversations like this are valuable precisely because they don't always produce simple answers. The remark felt like a summary of the entire exchange, delivered without edge. The audience responded with applause, louder this time, signaling appreciation for the conversation as a whole. Kim smiled broadly and thanked the hosts, her tone warm and appreciative. Joy returned the smile, adding a quick thank you of her own. The moment felt resolved, not because every disagreement had been settled, but because it had been handled openly. As the cameras pulled back and the show prepared to transition, viewers were left with the impression that they had witnessed something authentic. The exchange hadn't been dramatic or explosive, but it had been real. It reflected the kind of nuanced disagreement that often unfolds in public spaces, especially when influence, responsibility, and perception intersect. For those watching live, it was the kind of segment that prompts reflection rather than instant judgment. And as the show moved on, the table reset, the hosts adjusted their papers, and the studio audience settled back into their seats. The conversation lingered, both in the room and beyond it, ready to be replayed, discussed, and debated long after the broadcast ended. As the hour moved forward, the earlier exchange continued to cast a quiet shadow over the rest of the broadcast, even as the show shifted into its usual rhythm. For viewers watching closely, there was a noticeable difference in how the hosts interacted with one another for the next few segments. The conversation remained professional and fluid, but there was a heightened awareness in the pacing, as if everyone at the table was being a little more deliberate with their words after what had just unfolded. Kim was no longer on set by this point, having exited to polite applause and a few exchanged thank yous once the cameras cut away. But her presence lingered in the tone of the discussion that followed. When the hosts transitioned to another topic, Joy was quieter than usual at first, listening more than speaking, letting the others take the lead. This wasn't unusual for her, but in the context of the earlier exchange, it stood out. One of the co-hosts referenced the importance of civil disagreement, framing it as something viewers expect from a show like this. She didn't name Kim directly, but the timing made the connection clear. The comment felt almost like a reassurance to the audience, a way of saying that what they had just watched was part of the show's DNA rather than a disruption. Joy nodded along, offering a brief agreement without expanding on it. As the conversation progressed, Joy gradually re-engaged, adding her perspective with the same measured tone she'd used toward the end of Kim's segment. There was no trace of irritation or defensiveness. Instead, her comments reflected the role she often plays on the panel, pushing for clarity and depth without dominating the discussion. For viewers who might have interpreted the earlier moment as confrontational, this shift reinforced that it hadn't been personal, but contextual. Behind the scenes, producers were likely already aware that the Kim and Joy exchange would be a focal point once the episode aired. Moments like these, even when handled calmly, tend to resonate because they feel unscripted and human. In the control room, decisions were being made about which clips might be replayed later in the show or shared online. The conversation had been substantive, and that alone made it notable. Back in the studio, the audience seemed settled again, responding to cues with the usual applause and laughter. But there was a subtle attentiveness that hadn't been there at the start of the hour. It was as if the earlier discussion had reminded everyone that live television can veer into meaningful territory without warning. That awareness carried through the rest of the taping. Joy, for her part, appeared relaxed but reflective. When another topic touched on media responsibility, she briefly referenced how conversations can take unexpected turns on live TV. Her remark was general, almost offhand, but it echoed the experience viewers had just witnessed. The co-hosts smiled knowingly, and the audience let out a light laugh, recognizing the self-awareness. After the show wrapped, The immediate reactions began to surface online. Clips of the exchange between Kim and Joy were quickly shared across social platforms, often accompanied by captions that framed the moment in different ways depending on the poster's perspective. Some viewers praised Joy for asking questions they felt needed to be asked. Others defended Kim, emphasizing her efforts and the difficulty of navigating public scrutiny. Many noted how calmly the disagreement had been handled, especially compared to more heated exchanges seen elsewhere on television. In post-show interviews and online comments, neither Kim nor Joy escalated the moment. Kim, when asked about the appearance later, described it as a good conversation and said she appreciated the opportunity to explain her perspective. Her tone was consistent with how she'd spoken on the show, measured and composed. Joy, meanwhile, reiterated in a separate interview that her role on the panel is to ask questions viewers might be thinking, and that respectful disagreement is part of healthy dialogue. Within the production team, the segment was discussed as an example of the show functioning as intended. There had been no raised voices, no walk-offs, no need for commercial breaks to defuse tension. Instead, there had been a genuine exchange of ideas, shaped by differing life experiences and viewpoints. That, more than anything, made the moment resonate. For viewers who regularly watch daytime talk shows, the exchange felt familiar in structure, but distinctive in execution. It wasn't framed as a clash for ratings, and it wasn't edited to heighten drama. The tension built gradually, surfaced openly, and eased without being forced. That realism is often what keeps audiences engaged, even when the topics are uncomfortable. In the days following the broadcast, commentators and media writers reference the segment as an example of how celebrity interviews can move beyond promotion into substantive conversation. Some highlighted Joy's line of questioning as emblematic of her long-standing role on the show. Others focused on Kim's willingness to stay engaged rather than deflect. The discussion became less about who won and more about what the exchange represented. What stood out to many viewers was the body language throughout the segment. The way Kim leaned in when responding, the way Joy adjusted her posture when listening, the pauses that allowed thoughts to land. These details contributed to the sense that the conversation was unfolding organically rather than being steered toward a predetermined outcome. As clips continued to circulate, viewers who hadn't watched live weighed in, often projecting their own beliefs onto the exchange. Some interpreted Joy's skepticism as necessary accountability. Others saw it as an example of how women, particularly those from entertainment backgrounds, are questioned more harshly. Kim's supporters pointed to her calm demeanor as evidence of growth and resilience. Critics argued that calmness doesn't negate the need for scrutiny. The diversity of reactions underscored the very point Joy had made on the show. Influence invites interpretation, and interpretation is rarely uniform. Within the context of the episode, the segment became a defining moment, not because it disrupted the show, but because it highlighted its purpose. Daytime talk television, at its best, reflects the conversations happening beyond the studio walls. It mirrors the debates people have at their own tables, in workplaces, and online, often without clear resolutions. As the week went on, the show referenced the response briefly, thanking viewers for engaging thoughtfully. There was no formal statement or correction, just an acknowledgement that the conversation had struck a chord. That restraint mirrored the tone of the exchange itself, grounded and respectful. By the time the episode faded from the daily news cycle, it remained memorable precisely because it hadn't been sensationalized. It was a reminder that disagreement doesn't have to be loud to be impactful, and that live television can still create space for nuanced dialogue. And for viewers who watched it unfold in real time, the Kim Kardashian and Joy Behar moment stood as a quiet example of what happens when differing perspectives meet at the same table and neither side looks away. By the time the episode reached its final minutes, the earlier exchange between Kim Kardashian and Joy Behar had clearly become the moment viewers would remember most, even though the show itself didn't frame it that way. There was no recap banner, no dramatic callback, just a sense of having moved through something substantive together and now returning to the familiar cadence of daytime television. The hosts wrapped the hour the way they always do, thanking the audience, teasing the next episode, and exchanging brief, practiced smiles as the cameras pulled back. In the studio, The audience applause at the end felt steady and appreciative rather than enthusiastic or tense. People stood, gathered their belongings, and chatted quietly as the lights softened. There was no audible buzz of shock or confusion, just the low hum of conversation you'd expect after witnessing a thoughtful but serious discussion. Some audience members gestured as they talked, clearly replaying parts of the exchange in their own words. Others simply moved toward the exits, processing silently. Once the episode aired on the East Coast, viewer response began to solidify. Online discussions picked up quickly, but the tone of those discussions mirrored the segment itself more than sensational clips might suggest. Many viewers commented on how refreshing it was to see a disagreement unfold without raised voices or personal attacks. Others focused on specific moments, replaying Joy's questions or Kim's pauses, analyzing what those details revealed about each woman's perspective. On social media, short clips circulated with captions that reflected a range of interpretations. Some posts framed Joy's comments as a necessary reminder that influence comes with responsibility. Others highlighted Kim's composure, praising her for staying engaged rather than shutting down. A noticeable number of viewers pointed out that the conversation felt unfinished, not because it failed, but because complex topics rarely resolve neatly in a few minutes of airtime. The show's official accounts shared a neutral clip from the segment, choosing a moment where both women were speaking calmly. The accompanying caption emphasized conversation and perspective rather than conflict. That choice set the tone for how the moment was discussed more broadly. It wasn't presented as a clash, but as an exchange, inviting viewers to reflect rather than react. In the days that followed, both Kim and Joy were asked about the moment in separate appearances and interviews. Kim reiterated that she understood why questions are asked and said she believes those conversations are important, even when they're uncomfortable. She spoke about the value of listening and about recognizing that public dialogue is part of growth. Her comments didn't walk anything back, but they didn't escalate anything either. Joy, when addressing it later, framed the exchange as a typical example of her role on the show. She emphasized that asking questions doesn't mean dismissing someone's efforts, and that respectful skepticism is part of engaging honestly with public figures. She also noted that Kim handled the discussion professionally, a remark that was picked up and shared by viewers who appreciated the mutual acknowledgement. Among fans of the show, the segment became a reference point in broader conversations about what viewers want from daytime talk television. Some said it reminded them why they tune in because it reflects real conversations people have at home, where agreement isn't guaranteed. Others debated whether celebrities should expect tougher questioning as their influence grows. The disagreement extended beyond the episode, but in a way that felt aligned with its tone rather than in opposition to it. What stood out most in hindsight was how the moment ended, not with resolution but with restraint. There was no attempt to declare a winner or to summarize the disagreement into a neat takeaway. Instead, the segment closed with acknowledgement and professionalism, allowing viewers to sit with the complexity rather than being told what to think. For many, that was the most realistic part of all. Real conversations often end that way, not with consensus, but with a mutual understanding that different perspectives exist. In that sense, the exchange between Kim Kardashian and Joy Behar didn't feel shocking so much as revealing. It showed how quickly tone can shift on live television, how body language and pacing can signal deeper currents, and how experienced hosts navigate those moments without letting them derail the broadcast. As the clips continued to circulate and the discussion gradually slowed, the segment took its place among many other memorable daytime talk show moments. Not because it was explosive, but because it was grounded. It reminded viewers that tension doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful, and that calm disagreement can be just as compelling as heated debate. For those who watched live, it was one of those moments that stays with you after the TV is turned off. You remember the pauses, the careful wording, the way the room seemed to hold its breath before moving on. And for those who caught it later through clips or commentary, it offered a snapshot of what happens when public figures engage honestly under the bright lights of live television. That's where this story ultimately lands, not with a definitive conclusion, but with an open-ended conversation that continued beyond the studio walls. And now we want to hear from you. Share your opinion in the comments and let us know how you interpreted the exchange. And subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories that break down what really happens when the table turns on live TV.